It's past 8 here on the Ready Wammo Breakfast. Time to talk politics, the issues of the week with Russell Norman, co-leader of the Greens. Good morning to you, Russell.
Good morning, Wammo.
Of course, it is a budget week, but the Greens released an independent report this week about the asset sales. Tell us about that and what were the findings?
Yeah, we wanted to get an analysis done of the impact on the government budget, the fiscal impact of the asset sale program if it were to go ahead. So we got independent consultants in to do it, a company called Burl. Basically the findings are that if they go ahead with the asset sales, it has a very negative impact on the government's budget for the very simple reason that they'll lose the dividend stream, and the dividend return is much higher than the cost of debt for the government. So it had, a very negative impact on the government's budget, but they also looked at the impact on the overall economy. And the problem is, of course, that some of the shares will end up in overseas ownership, and the dividend flows on those shares will go overseas. So it will add to our overall current account deficit with the rest of the world, which is one of our major problems.
Okay, and I'd imagine the asset sales, though, are going to provide an initial cash injection that the government says it'll be able to reinvest into other so-called assets like hospitals and schools and that sort of thing, and improve the country's standing within those sort of areas. So does your report take into account those kind of things?
It does. So the government's position is, they say, well, they've got such a big deficit that they can't afford to fund the normal things governments fund, like schools and hospitals and so forth, out of cash, and so they have to sell some of these assets. Now, I would argue they've got themselves in a big deficit because they gave away very, very large tax cuts to high-income earners, and it's cost them a couple of $2 billion, and they're giving away very large subsidies to greenhouse polluters, which is costing them a couple of $2 billion. But anyway, so that's the reason why they're in a fiscal hole, and now they're telling us they have to sell the assets to build schools and hospitals. But anyway, the report did model the impact of that. And even if you have even if you assume that building schools and hospitals has a high rate of return, say 8% to the government, in terms of that investment, which is much higher than it is in the real world, you still end up in a worse fiscal position because the money, of course, doesn't produce a rate of return for some time, even if you assume that it does. So whichever way you look at it, it's bad news economically. So
John Key says, I'd rather trust Treasury's advice. Why isn't Treasury coming up with these kinds of figures?
Well, that's the thing, Treasury is. So they just don't want to hear it from anybody. So Treasury, in the budget policy statement, 2011, what they said was that if they went ahead with the privatisation program, selling these assets, the budget deficit would be worse by $94 million a year. For exactly the same reasons, that is, that you lose the dividend streams, and the dividend streams are much higher than the cost of debt that you're replacing. So Treasury have come up with exactly the same advice on the deficit. It's just that Treasury is purely ideological, and they go, well, it doesn't matter that it puts the government books in a worse position because privatisation is always good, which is the Treasury position, because it's basically new right, or it has been for a long time.
Okay, on to another issue, but it's closely tied in with asset sales. Meridian has decided not to dam the Mokihinui River on the west coast, the $300 million hydroelectric dam. Business commentator Bernard Hickey is saying that it could in fact be the looming partial share float that is behind Meridian's decision to abandon the project.
It's possible. Obviously it does. The company's under pressure because of the financials around the project. And the environment movement, is very committed to saving that river from Meridian's destruction. And so we've been running a very strong campaign, and that's caused Meridian quite a lot of financial pain, and they're in the court at the moment, or at least they were until they decided to abandon the project. So the financials did put a lot of pressure on Meridian, but whether it was the looming privatisation or whether it was just that having a big impact on their bottom line, they decided not to proceed. It's against the background of a pretty flat electricity demand. So across the economy, electricity demand's been pretty flat. So some of the business case for it dropped away, and then there's a bunch of alternative actually quite good hydro project on the west coast that will supply the electricity down there rather than going ahead with this dam on the Mokehanui.
Well, what's an example of a good project down there?
Oh, so there's a project called HDL, and what it does is it takes the acid water that comes off the Stockton Plateau. So as a result of all the coal mining on the Stockton Plateau, the water that comes off it is highly acidic, and currently it drains into a river called the Nukawo River. And the acidity is destroying all the biodiversity, all the life in that river. So what this project does is it collects all that water, that acid water coming off the Stockton Plateau, and then runs it through a series of tunnels and generates power as it drops down from the plateau down to the ocean, and then discharges the water straight into the ocean. Now, you have some localised effect from the discharge of that acid water where it comes out in the ocean, but it's much less than putting it through the Nukawo River. So you generate power and you have genuinely positive environmental impact. So it's a great project and a much better way to do it.
Fascinating project. Talking about the oceans, fishing has been on the agenda this week. And news this morning that foreign flagged fishing boats are to be banned from New Zealand waters. I'm not sure sort of how accurate that statement really is, but they're saying around 20 foreign vessels will be required to fly a New Zealand flag and be subject to our labour and health and safety rules within 4 years. I feel like I've heard that before when this issue has come up in previous years.
Well, no, I think this is genuinely good news and new. I think if they follow through on this, this will be good news because these are slave ships. Some of these ships are total slave ships. So if they enforce the law, it will mean that those crews working on those ships won't be subject to the slavery conditions. Or it will mean the slavery ships will have to go somewhere else, which I guess is probably more likely. But at least it restricts their access to New Zealand fishing grounds.
But at the end of
it's a positive development.
At the end of the day, even if the employment contracts are enforced for these foreign workers on these boats, without the actual people monitoring what's going on the boats, we could still see the same situation with the wrong fish being caught and then thrown away.
I think that's true, and so it will depend on the monitoring. But up to now, there's nothing to monitor because they're not because we don't apply New Zealand labour laws to what they're doing or maritime laws to what they're doing. So at the moment, we can't even do anything, even if we were monitoring. So this is a first step. So the rules are in place, and then the next step is to enforce the rules.
How culpable with this fishing situation are iwi, where they've been given fishing rights around the New Zealand coastline, but rather than employing local people to fish those fishing rights, they are employing overseas fishing vessels?
Well, anyone who's doing it is culpable, and that does include some of the iwi groups. And so, basically this is the cheapest way to get the quota filled, is to get slaves in. And so some iwi groups have been getting slave ships to fill their quota, as have other fishing groups. And I think that's totally unacceptable, and I'm very pleased the government's moving on it. So
eventually, do you think the government should say, well, if we're giving you these fishing rights here, there and everywhere, that's fine, but we make sure that all those vessels are crewed by New Zealanders?
Well, it's more, I just think there should be a level playing field. I mean, I don't particularly want to single out the iwi groups because others are doing it as well. I just think it applies to everybody who's got New Zealand fishing quota. Minimum New Zealand labour laws should apply, full stop.
Okay. Thanks very much, Russell. Cheers.
All right. Cheers, mate.
Russell Norman, co-leader